This is The Hypothesis, the show where industry experts debate and discuss growth marketing approaches, digital advertising tactics, measurement plans, as well as creative and growth strategies.
Hi, I'm Phil Ware, VP of Strategy at Thrive Digital.
And I'm Eric Sloan, VP of Data and Strategy at Thrive Digital.
And I'm your moderator, lay marketer, and asker of clarifying questions, Santana Blanchett. Hi, friends. On today's episode of The Hypothesis, we are going to delve into our platform overlords. So today we're going to talk about strategic channel expansion and how to diversify beyond the big two. So today's hypothesis is that we should be looking at channels beyond Meta and Google. So question one is, what is the average media mix or diversity of different types and sizes of organizations right now? Like, how are organizations currently handling their media mix?
I think the media mix right now, anyways, that I see is that most brands are heavily invested into search and Meta social. And so that's Google and Meta. But even as far as Google goes, a lot of brands aren't even investing into display or YouTube in the Google sphere. So it's probably 80 to 90% is what I have seen in terms of Google and Meta specifically.
Yeah, I love that, Eric. And like I have similar kind of responses to how brands are kind of going out to market with a different channel mix. The overall kind of narrative, I think that really comes to the fore for me is that it's not enough to just say Google and Meta are the channels that people are using, because within those, there are different tactics that people are really leaning heavy into, or they are not leveraging yet, and for good reason in some instances. So to your point, I think there are a lot of businesses who look at their bread and butter as being meta prospecting and retargeting, and Google search as the kind of bedrock of their marketing campaigns and their growth marketing strategy. But within that, there are so many different ways of slicing and dicing that overall spend that they put into market in that channel mix. Is that Google search budget all branded search? Is it all competitor? Is it all non-brand? All of that is like highly varied per brand. What I will also mention is that as you look at different sorts of brands spending very different budget amounts, you're seeing that channel mix very quickly diversifies into other channels, be that a good thing or a bad thing that we're going to talk about more today. But there is a instance where I would say going beyond Google and Meta can be a mistake for some brands, but it is also a necessity for others. And it all depends on where that brand is at in their kind of marketing maturity curve, if you will.
Well, one of the things that I see a lot, and I'm curious if you see this as well, I'm sure you do, but basically is that search advertising is the first thing, right? So if you're going to start doing any kind of digital advertising, you go to search first, you set up a couple of campaigns. If you're doing it well, you're splitting out branded search and non-branded search. Some accounts don't do that as well as they probably should be doing it. But search is kind of the first thing, and it makes sense, right? Some consumer is sitting down at their computer or using their phone, and they are searching for something. So there's active intent right there, right? And so you want to be in front of that active intent. So it does make sense to do search advertising as a first step. But is that even advertising, I guess, is another question. However, I think that that's the first step. And then most brands are expanding from there. And so when they are expanding, Meta seems to be that next natural step. And that also makes sense. You have retargeting options. You have, of course, prospecting options. And the reality is that the vast majority of businesses, most of their target market is on Meta and Google, and you can reach them through those two channels. So I think that's naturally why it ends up happening that way, and why 80 to 90% of digital advertising is happening there for most of the brands that aren't these massive brands.
Well, if you think about it too, a lot of the brands that are smaller and starting out advertising, search is very easy to understand. Like, it's a very simple transaction where, hey, I can target XYZ person who's searching for my product. I put an ad in front of them. There is less of this ambiguity around audiences, or I need creative that really resonates. Like, it's a very simple ad product to understand. So I also see that is a kind of very easy way for people to start getting into, their marketing. But one of the other kind of conversations I'd want to open up here is Meta even the right secondary choice to go to after Google search? It's often the one that people default to because it's got a huge amount of kind of user base that use it frequently across their various products, be that Instagram or Meta itself, traditionally Facebook. But how do brands validate that that's the right choice? I've seen brands just default to be like, well, yeah, that's the next logical choice for me, but they're not taking a step back and thinking, wait, are my audience actually there?
Right.
An example comes to mind for me where I have two nephews who are 16, 18. They never go on Instagram, they never go on Meta, they are on Snapchat and TikTok. So if you were a brand trying to reach that demographic and you're just defaulting to Meta, you're potentially missing out on your demographic completely. Well, not completely, that's too much of a strong word, but like you're missing out on a good chunk of your user base who would be interested in your product. So do you feel like brands are listening to their audience enough and their user base enough before making those channel choices very early on in their kind of exploration beyond Google search?
Just teeing me up, Phil, because I think that they're really focused on actually what is easy to measure, what is easy to deploy into the market, as opposed to what is customer centric. So like, yes, the majority of a lot of companies' markets are going to be on Facebook, Instagram, or Google, like accessible through that, right? And so there are some edge cases. I would say that that's not necessarily the rule, but maybe the exception. But yes, I would agree that like focusing first on the customer as opposed to what is easy to measure, what channels are easy to deploy, what channels maybe have the best algorithm. I'm looking at, Meta there in terms of optimization algorithms. That tends to be, I think, what drives some of those early digital advertising media mix decisions rather than, hey, is this actually the best way to reach our market and to communicate to our market, right? Because those are the two pieces. They may be on Facebook or they may be on Instagram, but are those places the best context for actually reaching them, for communicating what you want to communicate to them? Yeah. Are those the best places to do that? And it's not always the case, but I would say that in a lot of cases it is, right? And for a lot of businesses, running on Google and running on Facebook, Instagram through Meta ads is going to be a successful early program. Yeah. Once you start to get to the point where you have a much more complex user journey, you're trying to reach people at different stages of that user journey, you're trying to reach people in different contexts, that's when you want to diversify. But really, that initial program, I think, is usually served pretty well with Google and Meta.
My question, too, is actually going to be how do we feel that marketers are currently going wrong with selecting their media mix? And so you're kind of getting into that already, Eric, but what you're saying is they're going in based on what's easy versus where their audience is. Is that correct?
For choosing the tactics, absolutely. So a lot of advertisers or a lot of organizations who are doing digital advertising are choosing what's easy to measure or what's easy to deploy, right? And Meta and Google have the most sophisticated ways or the easiest ways to go from, hey, I want to launch a campaign to launching a campaign. It's very, very easy to set up a search account. It's very, very easy to set up, even easier, I guess, like something like PMax or a Facebook account, Facebook campaign that just targets a whole bunch of people. It's really easy to waste money that way, but it is also super simple to get a campaign into market, right? And so I think that that's one of the driving factors. I think the other driving factor is ease of measurability, or what organizations think is easy to measure, because, we don't need to get into a conversation about attribution here, but when you think about the reporting that you get out of Meta and Google, it's simple to explain. It's going to show some kind of return relatively fast. You don't need a data team in order to understand those numbers.
Yeah, I think if you think about the ad platforms themselves, they've been around for, Meta, let's say a solid 7-8 years, where it's really been, a great platform. Google Search as an ad platform has been around for 10 plus years, and they are very sophisticated in terms of their front end. There is a lot of I suppose, like knobs to turn and switches to flick to really dive into the ad platform itself, and how brands can really, I guess, feel like they're having an impact on their marketing. Whereas when you look at some of the more, I guess, like new ad platforms like a TikTok or a Snap, it's a bit more limited. And there's developments happening all the time, of course, in those areas, but they are by no means as sophisticated or have that clear front end that in some instances, especially with Google, can be quite salesy to help people who are maybe less expert in the space try to understand, I'm missing out on a keyword here. I'm duplicating my keywords in these areas. If I strip one out, it's going to help my efficiency. If I ramp up budgets here, it's going to help me grow. So there's almost these like sales elements built into these ad platforms that make it easier for people to scale and be their kind of like right hand marketing person, if you will.
But where this goes wrong, of course, is that all of those things translate into overinvestment, right? And so the most common overinvestment that I see anyways is with search advertising, because it's so easy, because it's the very first place that so many brands go to when they start any kind of digital advertising program, is that they start investing in search, they start seeing a result, and they're like, hey, we just want to amplify this result. We want to get more out of this channel. And that ultimately tends to lead to overinvestment in the channel because you want to keep pushing it further and further. And the reality is that especially a channel like search has a natural limit, right? There's only so many people searching for high quality, high intent keywords. And so when you saturate all of those high intent keywords, the only place to go is lower and lower and lower intent keywords. And so you start over investing in the channel and you start to see diminishing returns, right? And so I think that that's ultimately where it starts to go wrong, is that you end up over investing in these channels because they're easy, because it's simple to deploy. It's, you're getting easy reporting. It's easy to interpret, all of that kind of stuff. And when you start getting into YouTube advertising, when you start getting into CTV or TikTok, it becomes a lot muddier, right? Like you don't know precisely what's working and what's not working, and that can be troublesome. And so that does lead to this overinvestment in these other channels.
What would be some signals or signs that you are over investing in a channel? Are there any like easily identifiable signals or signs that you're over investing in a channel or a tactic?
Well, a depletion of performance over time is the number one sign. But the thing that I tend to say is reduce your spend in a channel if you haven't in a while. Like if you haven't changed your investment in Google search, for example, in 6 months or longer, that hopefully it's not longer, but if you haven't had any kind of fluctuation in that investment, pull it back by 20% and see if the volume of sales or leads or whatever your KPI is, if that volume doesn't move, you're already past the point of diminishing returns. And it's super, super common to just pull back by 20% and the actual volume of sales coming from those campaigns stays the same. That means that you're already oversaturated in that channel, and you probably need to do some additional testing, whether that's incrementality testing or at the very least just trying to understand that point of diminishing returns.
You're talking through when's the right time to diversify, and there's a fine line there, I think, between making that call to diversify into different channels, but also doing so too early can be equally as damaging to your marketing program. Where I've seen this kind of go wrong from a diversification standpoint is making that call to diversify too early. And you essentially, I'm going to be cheesy here, say diversify your overall channel mix. And by doing so, you are essentially saying, I'm going to take $100 a day and go and spend that in a net new channel that I haven't really thought about the user experience. I don't have the right creative for it, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. All that brands are doing in that case is adding confusion to the media mix, taking attention away from the channels that are actually going to make an impact on your marketing program from a top line perspective, and that they haven't necessarily gone through that process you just mentioned, Eric, where like they are validating that they're at that point of diminishing returns or not. So it's essentially adding more risk and complexity into the marketing program that is unnecessary and doesn't necessarily produce the trade-off that's required. So there's almost a very clear phasing that brand needs to go through so they don't diversify, and that they diversify in the right way.
Right.
We've been talking about why what are some signals that you should not diversify, or why we shouldn't expand too quickly too soon. But when and why should marketers diversify channels? When should they expand?
Can I actually ask a real brief question about diversifying too early before we move to that? I'm really curious, Phil. What are you seeing in terms of brands actually diversifying too early? Like, I would suspect that part of it comes down to them thinking that they've already saturated a channel, so they've already hit that point of diminishing returns. But if you're spending, for example, $100, $150 a day on Facebook or something, that is not the time to diversify, right? You have not saturated Facebook advertising. There's way more room to run there. And it's probably more of an indicator that your advertising is not effective. And that could be creative, that could be audience targeting, it could be landing pages, it could be a number of different things. But I would say that it's almost like ineffective marketing is actually pushing brands to diversify too early.
Right.
Is that safe to say?
That's where I was kind of getting at with that is if you look at a brand's set of channels that they're operating within that are the usual suspects, if they're seeing that they're hitting that point of diminishing returns or they're not seeing performance from Google search or Facebook, there's probably a bigger problem at play. And that is either like a product market fit problem, a positioning problem, a landing page problem, pricing, a whole host of different issues. But it could also be something as simple as the creative just isn't resonating. So if you're immediately saying, well, my friend tried Snapchat for his brand and it worked great, I'm going to go and do the same because it worked for them. There's almost this like distraction by the shiny object syndrome where you get distracted based upon what someone else is doing that might not actually be a fit for your business. So by going and investing that $100 a day in that additional channel that is just going out with the same creative that isn't resonating on other channels, why not take that $100 and pump that into new creative production? The marginal return on that could potentially be much higher because you're setting yourself up for success within those core channels, but the new channels that you're going to be exploring in the future. So I think there's an excitement that comes from testing something new. And it's almost quite glamorous to say like, oh, I'm on Snapchat, I'm on TikTok, I'm on all these channels. But in fact, the investment in the less glamorous stuff like creative development and landing page development, that should probably be done first if you're not seeing these core channels perform.
That is like a seeking of quick wins, right? And it's that example that you said there, hey, my friend or my colleague tried Snapchat advertising and it really worked for them in a different organization with different creative, with a different business model and all those kinds of things. But you ignore that and you say, hey, it must be Snapchat. And maybe there's golden riches in Snapchat as a result of that. But that's seeking quick wins as opposed to saying to yourself, we have something that's working. Now we want to amplify it with advertising. We want to go out and we want to distribute this message because we know that this message is working. We want to distribute it to wherever our customer is. And to answer your question, Santana, like making it customer centric, I think is the answer to when do you diversify? When do you choose a new channel? You say to yourself, we have a message that resonates with our target market. Now we want to go out and we want to communicate that message to our target market in as many places as they hang out, as they are actually active in, right? And so that could be Snapchat, that could be TikTok in terms of these expansions, but it's probably more likely to be something like CTV, which is hard to measure and harder to set up, and those types of things takes more creative resources, etc. But if you make it customer centric, then it becomes more obvious which channels you need to push into and when, because it's like, hey, we've sort of reached our limit with meta advertising in terms of reaching all of our target market with the communications that we want to reach them with. Now we need to seek other ways to distribute that message.
I really like what you're saying, and I want to come back to it in 2 seconds, but I want to ask Phil a follow-up question to his point before we move on entirely. Phil, when talking about when you shouldn't move on from a channel, how can someone understand if they have if they feel like it's not performing, how do they understand if it's the wrong targeting and the wrong setup or the creative's off? Like, how do they determine between the two of like what's going wrong?
It's always tough to dissect that fully because targeting is becoming somewhat less important as we think about various different ad platforms delivering more and more ads based upon broad targeting. So the targeting can be done by the creative. So if you're going out to a broad audience, US Open, for example, your creative kind of becomes your targeting. So if your creative features people of a certain demographic, they're going to be the ones most likely to engage with that ad. Let's say it's a 18 to 25-year-old in the ad. Those are the people who are probably going to interact with that ad versus someone that you might be trying to target in their 50s. Again, it's like marketing 101 of like, feature the people in the ad that you want to be using your product. But when you think about what might be broken, there are logical ways you could go about that. So if you've got a very distinct group of users who you're going to market towards, let's say you've got a lookalike of your best purchases that are high LTV, and you're really trying to target a cohort of those in Meta, let's say. If you're putting an ad out there to reach those people who should, on paper, be very much in market for your product, but you're seeing low hook rates, you're seeing low engagement on the ad, low view through, low click through rate, there's probably a creative problem at play. And the question that people should be asking themselves is, when was the last time we changed up our creative? And if we're stagnant in terms of what we're putting into market from a creative standpoint, it's probably no wonder that people aren't really engaging with it. Should we be thinking about testing something net new? So kind of a long-winded answer, but the summary there is like, it's always going to be hard to say which one's the problem, but there are some ways to test it. And creative is probably where I'd look first, just to like, when was the last time you tested something net new? And is the creative feeling fresh, or is it feeling kind of stagnant?
It's interesting because like this conversation almost hinges upon this idea that you've already been doing this for a while, right? Like you really shouldn't consider diversification or where your ads might be going wrong until you've been doing it long enough to say either that it's not working or you need to do more, or you have enough data to know what your ideal leads are. Like you almost have to be in market long enough for any of this to apply. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a baseline you need to have in place so you know what you're measuring against. If you're 1 month into search and meta advertising, and you're like, this isn't working, it's time to test out 5 new channels, that's probably not the best course of action. Like you probably want to look back at, well, what's not resonating here? Where is the user journey dropping off? Am I not resonating with people who are interacting with that ad for the first time? Is it that they're coming through onto the website and they are not engaging with our website at all because it's a poor landing page experience? That's where looking back at that user journey and critically trying to say what might not be working is what I would look at before diversifying again into all these different ad channels.
That makes sense to me. So then getting back to you, Eric, when I asked the question, when and why should marketers diversify, and you're saying be customer centric, like what do they want? How would the two of you go about determining that it is time to move on to new channels and what your customers do want?
Yeah, so when it comes to when is the right time to diversify, I think there is that diminishing returns conversation, right? When do you feel like you have hit that point where you're pumping in money, but it's not necessarily delivering any more top line revenue? If you've done some of that testing and it's clear that you are not getting incremental returns from that budget, then pull back. Then it's time to explore elsewhere. And when you're feeling confident that you've done your due diligence, that you have reached that point. And there's also a lot of pressure and I guess narrative in the marketplace that brands need to diversify because of the big changes that have happened over the past few years with iOS 14 within Meta. That brands suddenly saw this huge drop off in performance, which you could argue wasn't actually real in some cases. It was just that conversions weren't being recorded anymore, but those conversions were still happening. And that there's certainly some sentiment in the marketplace that ad platforms like TikTok, they are moving through some challenging legislative issues right now. So if you are a brand that's only operating on TikTok, you probably should be thinking about, how do I safeguard my business and try to advertise on other channels that um, might be more stable in the future. So it's the same as like an investment portfolio. Like if you're overly invested in a single asset, that's a dangerous place to be. It have potentially huge wins, but also huge risks. So there is a balance to be made with any investment portfolio between under diversification and over diversification, and find that correct risk reward ratio with those different channels. So yeah, that's kind of my sense on that is that there's never like a perfect time. I think there's always going to be arguments for and against trying to diversify, but you need to have done your due diligence and trying to test out if it's the right time first.
The other thing I would add to this, because I totally agree with that in terms of like when and how to sort of diversify. But the other piece of this is diversifying into other advertising channels can also teach you something about your customer, right? And I keep coming back to this customer-centric view of your marketing program because I think it's important. And I think that if you go out and you test a different style of creative, for example, on TikTok, and your typical advertising program is Google and Meta centric, testing out new creative or testing out even your existing creative on TikTok can really teach you something about your customers as well, right? And so maybe you're going out and you're trying UGC, or maybe you're trying some different type of creative angle, or you've mapped out your customer journey and you say, hey, there's this gap in terms of how we're reaching our customers. Maybe it's further up the funnel, maybe it's in the mid funnel, something along those lines. There's this communication gap where we're not really addressing this one key point that our consumers need to know about in order to make an informed decision. And so we're going to go and test that communication on TikTok. And that's a way of sort of diversifying your marketing program while also learning something about your customer itself. I really think it comes down to making these decisions not from a tactical lens through, hey, we have 3 channels, so we need to go to 4, and more so, hey, what makes sense for the customer? Let's refocus this on how are we reaching them? How are we communicating to them? Are we hitting them at the right stages of their consideration cycle, etc.? And that will sort of lead you down this path of, okay, TikTok seems to make sense based off of all of those factors. Now let's go and test it and see if it's actually working. And if it does work, then you can scale it. If it doesn't work, then you can reevaluate at that point.
To respond to that, it almost feels like, going back to our big swing conversation a couple of weeks ago, this is really treating a channel launch that is net new to the brand as a bit of a big swing. Like, make sure you're going into it with eyes wide open, and that you've got a clear plan for how you're going to go to market, how you're measuring it. Are you set up for success? The amount of times that I've seen brands launch into a channel where like tracking's not been set up correctly, or the creative is like mismatched with what worked for this other channel, so I'm going to shoehorn it in here, and then the results turn out to be poor, and it's not the ideal setup. You're going into a test with a C- as far as preparation goes, versus setting it up for a potential success. So really go into it with eyes wide open, and plan for what that experiment is going to be, because this is an experiment. What are you trying to learn? And make sure you've got a very clear idea going in what the outcomes could be, and are you prepared for that execution? That would be a kind of key piece of advice in that too.
As a content marketer, I'm curious. I would almost wonder if there's an opportunity for organic and paid to chat and say what organic channels have been successful for us. Like, am I wrong in that assumption? Like, are there some internal conversations that can happen between departments to say like, hey, social team here, we've noticed that TikTok's been killing it for us, but we've been doing no paid here. Like, are those conversations that can happen to ease the process?
I mean, 1,000% yes.
Yeah.
and that's where, like, I think growth marketers, even like in paid specialists, they need to be looking at the big picture and looking at where organic traffic is coming from, talking to key stakeholders within the organization, and understanding those ebbs and flows in the business. Because if you're seeing that TikTok is gaining a load of followers, you're getting a lot of virality on the platform, a lot of engagement, then it seems like a bit of a no-brainer that we shouldn't be experimenting with paid there to even promote some of those organic posts naturally, and try to lean into kind of like add some jet fuel, if you will, to what's already working. So yeah, I mean, absolutely, Santana. I think it needs to be a more kind of less siloed approach, if you will, and more holistic in terms of where you see in that brand grow through a number of these different channels.
Yeah, I mean, every organization needs a mechanism to cross those silos, because the copy that you test in advertising can be used for landing pages or for the website, and vice versa. So your conversion rate optimization tests may teach you something about what types of objections that your consumers need to hear about in order to actually convert, right? And so taking those learnings and passing them back to advertising creative is super, super important as well. As you mentioned, organic to ads as well. I mean, the customers are the same, right? Just because you're reaching them through advertising versus reaching them through organic, your target market is the same, right? And so, yes, advertising is going to convert at a lower amount typically because you're sort of pushing people through that funnel as opposed to them coming to the funnel. But it's still the same people, right? And so what you learn in one area of your go-to-market strategy can be applied across other areas, 100%.
It comes up every single episode, and we almost need to do an episode on it, but incentives, right? Like, how are you incentivizing your teams to work together? And I think back to when I worked in college, I worked retail jobs throughout. And stores, in my personal experience, the stores that had individual sales targets versus the stores that had team targets, like the team target stores just performed night and day better. And I think that's applicable here, right? Like, how are you incentivizing all your groups to work to a singular goal, like where organic and paid do talk regularly?
And there's a lot of crossover too. The way I always kind of look at it is a rising tide raises all ships. So if there is
100%.
a single channel that is really performing, there's going to be benefits that the whole business gets from that. And if there's a cross collaboration that can happen around, let's say, launching on TikTok, that benefits the whole business, and like it should be more collaborative. So yeah, I completely agree, Santana, that like breaking down some of those, I guess, silos is important, but creating the right incentives and even some healthy competition sometimes can be pretty helpful. So I could talk about that one for hours, but that's certainly an interesting kind of narrative to take.
Okay, well then that brings me to my final question, which is, this is going to be a hard one to answer, but it is every time, so that's fine. What channels do you think marketers will be investing more heavily in 5 years from now?
I think we're going to see way more CTV and way more digital out of home.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And the reason for that is measurement is changing. Privacy laws are changing how we as digital marketers are measuring the effectiveness of what we do. And that's a great thing in my eyes. Essentially what it's causing is it's forcing marketers to really rethink the effectiveness of their advertising, where they're advertising, et cetera, because it's getting harder to get the granularity in what ad is working better or worse, right? And so it's really going to push marketers to think outside of the Google and Meta box, I would say. And I think in 5 years, especially, we're going to see a lot more brands on CTV. We're going to see a lot more brands on digital out of home, other types of channels that probably 10 years ago would be scoffed at because it's hard to measure, or there's no attribution, or we can't measure clicks, and so that's kind of beneath us as digital marketers. All of those channels, I think, are going to see a resurgence, and the technology is also going to allow smaller and smaller brands to invest in those areas as well. So it's not just going to be the big CPG brands that are doing that type of advertising. It's going to be all a diverse set of brands.
Yeah, and I'll spin off of that and say I think it's going to be a blend of us going back in time a bit and also going forwards in time a bit, with being very innovative on these new channels that we haven't even thought of yet. So yes, I think the going back in time piece is thinking back in time to where there was TV advertising out of home, like really just thinking about what is that broader strategy looking like outside of digital. So alluding to what Eric said, like digital out of home, CTV, those are going to be bigger parts of the kind of channel mix. But I also think 5-10 years time, the way in which we're using all these digital channels is going to be massively different. It's going to be a lot more consolidated in terms of the ad products that are available. And we might just be trying to buy impressions on AI assistants. So if we're interacting with Google, maybe it's less so that we're buying a search ad or we're buying a YouTube ad. It's us saying, hey, Google, I'm trying to reach this sort of customer, figure out where this fits into this AI conversation that you're having with each one of your different users, figure out where the right impression is at the right time, and do that for us. So I think there's going to be some blend of that. I'm not going to posit on where AI is going to go. I think that could be a a very big can of worms to open. But like you're already seeing it. Like you're already seeing that a lot of these channels like Meta and Google have these AI kind of conversations already active, and I'm using them all the time. So how do you as marketers interact with those new products and the way in which users are interacting with these tech giants? That's going to be where the industry shifts, I think, in terms of that channel diversification.
Interesting. I see a creative renaissance, to be honest with
Mm.
you. I think AI is going to democratize so many ad tools. It's going to become a bit homogenous out there for what everyone can do. And I think we're going to see a creative renaissance where people are investing more heavily in that again, because humans are the only way to set apart some of these like creative outputs.
No, I agree. Like, especially when you're thinking about CTV or digital out of home, like it's all creative. Like you got to make sure that that creative really pops and stands out from what that user might be doing at that moment. So yeah, I
Yeah,
think it's going to be a really interesting next 5 years. That's for sure.
100%. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today, friends. It was a good tactical episode, I think. This has been The Hypothesis. Thank you so much for tuning in. For show notes or to get in touch, find us at thehypothesisshow.com or at Thrive Digital, both linked for you in our description box. And if you liked today's episode, we'd love if you'd rate and review wherever you're listening or watching. Thanks!